Back in 2017, the dominant post-election analysts held that the people who voted for the squatter, Donald Trump, were driven into the arms of the billionaire populist demagogue out of an overwhelming sense of economic anxiety. Political pundits had spent months wringing their hands over how the Democrats had somehow failed to address this basic work a day kitchen table issue of this hard scrabble Americans of these hard scrabble Americans, while Donald Trump gave them hope that he would ease their burdens with his very stable business genius, which he wasn't very he didn't know how to run a business anyway, failed on that part. That was never very accurate, as anyone observing the Trump phenomenon could see. These voters were just mad at the fact that society is changing and they feel that they are losing their status. In other words, they don't want to share the culture equally with people who think and live differently than they do. Donald Trump spoke the language of grievance and exclusion, and they reveled in it. They followed him around like a bunch of red-headed deadheads, dancing, chanting, and cheering, inbreedingly and ecstatically at every insult, degrading remarks that he made, unashamedly telling the press that they loved him because he said out loud what they were thinking. Yeah, but he wasn't very smart at what he was thinking anyway. Um, despite losing his re-election, which we already knew he did, being impeached twice and overseeing the worst pandemic response of all developed countries, and inciting an insurrection that was based on the colossal lie that the election was stolen. Most of them are still with Trump because they're fucking idiots. If anything, they have gone way beyond simple grievance about losing their status, as this series of interviews by CNN's Donnie Sullivan at last week's cpac illustrates. There's a video there, but I'm not going to play it. You might think it makes sense to chalk up all those comments to the fringes of the fringe, but this would be all wrong. Political scientists Christopher Sebastian Parker and Rachel Bloom at the Washington Post's Monkey Cage recently surveyed about the maggot followers, and the findings were predictable. At least half are white, Christian, male, over 65 years old and retired, and earning barely $50,000 a year. It turns out that 30% have college degrees, so the idea that it's all about non-college educated voters is at least somewhat erroneous, according to the Post. The maggot sycophants overwhelmingly believe Trump's election misinformation, as well as other conspiracy theories. Nearly 100% of the maggot sycophants believe Trump's claim that the election was stolen. That's because they're fucking stupid. 70% support Trump remaining in office beyond the allowed 2 terms, which won't happen because they're fucking idiots. Their distrust extends to other areas as well. They overwhelmingly agree, in proportions of an 80% or higher, with statements suggesting that unknown elites control America and with the conspiracy theories surrounding COVID-19. The maggot sycophants are also biased against blacks, immigrants, and women. They fully accept Trump's rhetoric on these groups and downplay any obstacles that are faced by black Americans, and they view immigration as a threat to U.S. laws and culture, and agree women are seeking special favors, or worse, trying to control the men. That's because they're fucking stupid. This is a very radical group of people, and they are much more extreme than they were back in 2016. These are self-described maggot sycophantic believers, so perhaps they don't accurately represent all Republican voters, but the fact is that most Republicans do support Donald Trump, and it's hard to separate him from his wild set of beliefs. Certainly, the rejection of all reason and facts concerning the election results and democratic norms applies across this board. New York Magazine's Ben Jacobs smartly observed that the American right has pretty much abandoned any pretense to libertarianism and is now much more aligned with the European right than it's ever been. And their their paeans to freedom are as shrill as ever. But as Jacob points out, the point seems to be more aimed at owning the Democrats than any adherence to principle. He notes that while there are some tepid gestures toward a small government economics, the overarching theme at cpac this year was demagogic culture war red meat, with strident warnings about Marxism and Black Lives Matter. Hardline stances set out on immigration and the rise of China, and newfound zeal to combat and regulate social media companies. And Jacobs notes that politicians they're all tried to tap into the but he fights ethos that fueled Trump's rise. The New York Times also reported that the crowd loved those that they perceived as fighters, from Senator Josh Hawley, but not a fighter anyway, he's a fucking dumbass, to South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, also not a fighter, and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, also not a fighter. They even like the lame demagoguery of former Secretary of State, the fat ass Mike Pompeo, which I find incomprehensible. They don't care if these people are right or wrong. It's their willingness to back down no matter what they admire. We could sit around and have academic debates about conservative policy, DeSantis says, but the question is, when the Klieg lights get hot, when the left comes after you, will you stay strong or will you fold? That's also what they loved about Trump, considering that perhaps the most disturbing parallel with European far-right nationalism and today's GOP is the big lie of the stolen election and the rejection of the peaceful transfer of power. As the New Yorkers, as the New Yorkers, Masha Justin points out, this widespread belief, validated and confirmed by all those fighters in the GOP and the right-wing media, has a disturbing precedent in recent political history. She tells the story of right-wing populist leaders like Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, and Poland's Jaroslaw Kaczynski, both of and both of whom were voted out of office after early failed terms and claimed that the vote was rigged and returned to office later to dismantle what was left of the democratic democracy, and they're still in office years later. Justin also quotes Bálint Magyar, who's the author of such books as the Post-Communist Mafia State and then the Anatomy of Post-Communist Regime, who defies their populism as an ideological instrument for the political program of morally constrained collective egoism. And this is what Gesson explains. Magyar suggested reading the definition backward to better understand it, and the egoistic voter who wants to disregard other people and help solely in himself can express this in a collective more easily than alone. The collective form helps frame the selfishness, the selfishness in loftier terms, deploying what they call homeland, America first, or ideas about keeping people safe from alien criminals. In the end, Magyar writes, such populism delegitimizes moral constraints and legitimizes the moral nihilism. Now go back and look at the characteristics of the maggot people surveyed by Parker and Bloom from the Monkey Cage. Magyar describes their leadership as well. At the cpac confab last week, South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem proudly took credit for refusing to follow the health guidelines that would have saved lives in the pandemic. And Texas Senator Ted Cruz mocked the necessity to wear masks. And the squatter that's in exile stood before them and insisted over and over again that the election was stolen from them. And that sure sounds like a political program of morally constrained egoism to me.